but you know what I'm saying.
Fun overall.
That's right.
Yeah.
With a dash of cheeky and a bit of brilliance.
A lot of salt.
And a lot of salt.
Okay, we're live. We are live. And week 8. We always sort of give, there's like a 8 where we're gonna let people sort of join in. I like to give sort of a second for people to plug in and get their whatever they need to do, their glasses of water. Paul, what are we
drinking?
Yeah.
Nespresso coffee. Ooh, corporations.
Not a
Or
belief.
an artisanal coffee is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's like a bougie middle class coffee.
Bougie Paul.
Yeah, that's a bougie side of me.
Well, I think we're a minute in. Everyone's here who's going to be here, and if you join in down the line, then you can always sort of go back and rewatch once this is posted again. But week 8, Sovereign Lands.
Yeah.
We have a very special guest with us today. And I realized that normally before these discussions, I get a rundown of our guest, and I didn't get one this week because this special guest, Sara Howdle, who's here with us today, I don't even so Sara, introduce yourself. So I will say this. I'm going to preface this by saying Sara has been behind the scenes for the past 8 weeks with us. She has helped shape our conversations. She has been an invaluable voice when it comes to fleshing out, answers to questions and helping us to really distill the conversations into really kind of meaningful channels. So we're very excited to have her here with us today, and for all of you to hear her wonderful sort of and incredibly informative takes on things. So Sara, do you want to introduce yourself to the group?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I appreciate that intro. My name is Sara Howdle. I work for Tracy Bear at the Faculty of Native Studies as her coordinator for the Indigenous Women and Youth Resilience Project. So I, along with a team of women at the U of A, we put together this Walls to Bridges program with the Institution for Women. So we teach there, which is Edmonton's federal women's prison. And I'm also a PhD candidate from York University in Toronto. And my research looked at originally the first sort of legal definition of status Indian and how that was essential for Canadian state formation. And then I went on to my PhD work, which is about Indigenous women's political organizations and specifically their work around status as an issue for women. I'm also a settler from Treaty 1 territory.
Oh,
yeah,
the best.
Yeah. I also have to say, even though, Sara prefaces and says she's my assistant, she's more collegial and more like my colleague. We do a lot of things together. And so, our project couldn't be what it is without Sara. And in fact, this show that we do with you couldn't be without Sara. So I'm so happy to have her on the show today.
And of course, we are joined, as always, by Dr. Tracy Bear and Dr. Paul Garrow. So, at this point, if we don't know who this group is, maybe start back at the beginning. So, Paul, I believe this week you will be doing the smudging.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay.
Because I feel I'm the only person left in their own home. So everyone else split or something. So this will be the first time that I smudge on camera. So it'll be really fun. I've got the smudge that was gifted to me by Colette Potra from Frog Lake Métis Settlement, which doesn't exist anymore, but it's always there in spirit. And I think it's very special, very special. It's part of our history and part of our shared history with Tracy too, which is really cool. She just told us a really good story. So thanks. So I will take off these things too, and these things, so I won't hear you. So don't speak badly of me while I'm doing this.
Promise.
Oh, jeez. Got to smudge better.
Wish I could smell
There
it.
it is. There you go. Oh, that's nice, huh?
Mm.
Right on.
Thanks, Paul.
Awesome, Paul. Thank you. Mm. Okay.
That's good.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Mhm.
Wow, week 8, Dan, and I know we've been learning a lot, and you had so much to say and talk about yesterday when we were sort of doing our pre-meeting. So many things came bubbling up for you. So did you want to share, like, what kinds of things were you thinking about?
Well, I mean, obviously there's a lot to just sort of discuss, and we have some really interesting questions this week that I think are going to spawn some interesting conversations. So I will let those cover the majority of sort of my takeaway, because I know I'll be talking about them later. But, you know, I think one of the big takeaways for me this week was we've talked about, I think, in a couple discussions at this point. In fact, it was one of the trivia. It was a trivia question that you asked people, which were the last 4 countries to subscribe to UNDRIP. And of course we know now that it was Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
What was never discussed when we were discussing those 4 countries is that Canada was the last by a long shot to subscribe. So that to me was a really new piece of information that really kind of colors the discussion even more intensely, I think, because again, going back to that national sense of pride, and I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with having a pride in your country if you are aware of what that country is all about. And I think these discussions have become so helpful in terms of understanding what pride in your country is and what you have to know in order to have all the pieces to be really proud of what your country stands for. So that is a huge thing for me. And it almost stood out that, like, when you're pushing back as much as Canada seemed to do, it almost illuminates guilt more. What exactly are you hiding, and what are you pushing back from when you are the last one pushing back? It almost feels like, and I'm not saying this is the truth, but it looks, you give the impression that you have the most to hide or that you have the most to lose. So in terms of discovering that Canada was the last country to join, that really changed for me in a way, optically, how the country looks on an international stage when it comes to its relations with Indigenous communities and peoples.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And you posed a really good question to all of us that really made us think, right? Like, why was Canada the last one to sign?
Exactly. What I mean, would you mind giving your thoughts on this? Because I'm sure that there are many. Why do you think Canada was the last to join or to sign up?
Just to touch a little bit, I like this idea of nationalism and pride in your country. And you're right, there is no harm in being, having pride in where you live in the country. And there are so many great things about Canada. And this idea that we have this unlearned history, and I've said this before, ignorance is bliss, but for whom? Where is the bliss? And having Canada protest so much about UNDRIP is absolutely telling in what they feel like they have to lose. And so obviously they were threatened. There's fear there. There's they're wondering about, we're the second largest landmass in Canada or in the world, right? Our country. So what do we have to lose? How many square kilometers do we have to share with Indigenous people? Whereas if we thought about the treaties were nation to nation. It was a shared vision, right? So I think they are, and continue to fight against this land reclamation, against sovereignty, self-determination, because for the most part, Canadians think they have so much to lose if they decide to share land, determination, and sovereignty.
Sarah, what do you think? You
did you just point your lips?
I did. I'm looking at her.
Oh.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think, when we look at what UNDRIP says, I think the issue is that it represents a relationship that could have been a long time ago as like equal partners of a nation-to-nation relationship. And it contradicts really a lot of the narratives that Canada was based on, which are terra nullius and manifest destiny, that this land was meant to be ruled by settlers. And so there's a real bottom line there that doesn't fit with the Canadian government's maybe like liberal democratic ideas of how Indigenous people should be participating, as opposed to in power, making big decisions that are related to your resource development and wealth distribution. So I think there's a real fear that the wealth will be redistributed differently, and that threatens people.
I think that's a legacy of Canada, right? Like, I keep seeing the beauty of these modules all adding up to a really overall learning, and we keep coming back to UNDRIP again and again because it's this it is a roadmap, right? And a roadmap to say to all countries engaged in a settler colonial mindset and an ideology that Indigenous people have power, they have agency, self-determination, sovereignty in ways that are different from settler perspectives. And what always kind of smacks me in the head every time, hits my mind, is that I feel like with a settler colonial ideology is about always relegating one's agency to institutions. Right? That could be the institution of the government of Canada, the institution of the Catholic Church or United Church, Protestant churches, anything, or Anglican Church. These institutions become the center point for identity, whereas Indigenous people, the center point for identity is about relations and national relations, nationalism, peoplehood, right? So these different ways of looking at things. And that's why it's man, we have to go back to UNDRIP and remind settler Canada that this is how you make good deals and this is how you engage in a good way. There's always this fear of the compromise, like you said, having to consult. The duty to consult is the scariest thing in the world for the crown, right, all the way through. So
I wonder too, in 2010 when Harper did sign it, there was a proviso. He said he would sign it, but the statement was that it was aspirational and there was nothing legally binding on it. So were the other three countries like that as well? Do you guys know? Because I'm asking these questions now, we're live, but I'm just wondering because there was that caveat, right? It's aspirational. There's nothing legally binding, but I'll sign.
Yeah,
What kind of a deal is that?
So solid, hey? Real legit.
Like signing some sort of legal document for your job or your life or your house, being I'll sign it for sure, but I can't guarantee anything about
getting married. This is aspirational, but not legally binding, right?
See ya.
And yet,
the Liberal government has said that they want to implement UNDRIP by the end of the year. They've said now that as a result of COVID, that might be pushed back. But I think everyone needs to pay real close attention about what implementing UNDRIP really means in practice, and not aspirationally, and make sure that they come through on that.
But this, I think, is what's so kind of what vibrates on such a high frequency for me during these lessons is that the government, what we're learning, and I certainly don't want this to feel like I'm just week after week coming down on the government.
Welcome to our space.
Yeah.
I am COVID negative. I've been tested. But what seems to be very clear is that the government has separated themselves and the rest of the country from Indigenous communities through everything that we're learning week after week. And in separating Canada from these communities, you are separating bridge building and you're separating information. And I think what's been so invaluable for so many of us who have been, coming to these lessons week after week is that the more we learn, the more we can advocate. The more we learn, the more clarity we have when it comes to something like UNDRIP, the more clarity we have to ask questions and to hold people accountable, like Harper in 2010, who is signing something and then saying like, it's not legally binding. The more that people learn and the more that people know, the more the pressure is on from a government standpoint to be held accountable for certain things. And I think, to me, I say this time and time again, everybody needs to be taking this course and everybody should be participating in some kind of educational course like this from a very early age. Because if Canadians have this information, you are bridging the gap between understanding communities that we have been systemically removed from as people. And when you don't have information, when you don't quite know what's going on, coupled with, just the constant distraction of life, it is very easy to just choose to not know.
Yeah.
And that's a terrible thing. That is a awful sort of side effect of just a culture that is constantly predicated on distracting people. But it is becoming just, the alarm bell is ringing, I think, for so many of us who are coming here week after week, that information is power, and information has the power to bind people together and actually hold people accountable so that change can happen. So it's really it's powerful and it's scary to see how slowly but surely government legislation can create a vast divide between Canadian settlers and the Indigenous communities and people within the country. As if to say, you guys stay over there, your life is cushy and everything's fine. I say that broadly. If you are taken care of, you don't have to worry or be concerned about the way that we are treating people on the other side. So that sort of, again, really comes to the top of my mind in terms of how information is so crucial. And how more needs to be done so that this perspective, which is absolutely invaluable to shaping a well-rounded understanding of our country, needs to be part of the Canadian mindset from a very young age.
Yeah, I agree. And I absolutely agree that children, if you put it to them in certain ways, can handle it. There's we get a lot of feedback, like grade 4 teachers, do you think I can use this with my grade 4s? And do you think I can do this with my grade 12s? I think that in doses and the way that you talk, like you don't talk about sex with, your 6-year-old in the way that you would for like a 13-year-old that's going out on the town. You would talk differently. And so these types of histories can absolutely be integrated into any grade level, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, touching on Dan's point, it's so essential to move forward to really, for Canadians to understand the logics that not only built this country, but also continue to be acted on, even when it's not said explicitly, but it's, the threads really still adhere to those fundamental ideologies. Canadians got to know what their country is built on and how their government works, because that's the only way to be able to actually engage.
Yeah.
I was mentioning this yesterday in the conversation that in a way, what I've been learning has really created like a new visual map of Canadian government for me. It's
Mhm.
like, I feel like with no information, you just see a law and you say, okay, well, this law must have been established at some point, someone who knew what they were doing, and I'll adhere to it because I'm a law-abiding citizen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there is such a cross section of our Canadian of the Canadian sort of legal system that we're uncovering in these discussions. And for me now, I see it quite clearly. There is us, there is Canadian law, and then underneath the surface, there are treaty and relations that have been made with Indigenous communities that are being pushed down so that all of us at the top aren't aware
Yeah.
of conflicts and contradictions.
That's
So it's a
right.
very clear system for me now to look at when laws are made in Canadian politics to say, okay, I now have the understanding to say, well, what is that law based on? And is it adhering to treaty? Is it something that is going to be helping or hurting some of the laws that had been established long before these people in government ever came into power? And that, I think, is so illuminating when it comes to just digesting what we're reading in the news when it comes to Canadian law.
I think that's a really good visual way to look at it, Dan. Like these layers that just keep, after we add on these layers, like they get pushed down and pushed down. Indigenous people, you see bubbling up once in a while, like, hey, wait a minute, what about this? You know, and Matt Wildcat talked about the fisheries, how we had this remembrance about, you know, the law, and, you know, they bubble up, but oftentimes that sedimentary, like those layers, just foundational, that's the foundation of Canada, is pushing all of that down, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, questions this week. Jillian, she thought it was a beast of a week, which is kind of a good way to put it. She wanted us to talk a little bit more about the relationship between the resurgence and revitalization of Indigenous laws and legal orders, and the stories at the heart of this week's lesson, talking about inherent rights, constitutional protections, sovereignty, Indigenous worldviews, and these absolutely integral connections to the land. So it was a really great, thanks Jillian for the question, really good way for us to talk about the module. And so we discuss this idea of Indigenous peoples who have always negotiated agency. We've always talked about this nation to nation negotiation, and Paul has every single time, you know, brought us back to this understanding that it's all about the relationship with people, right? So there is resurgence and revitalization, and we tend to sometimes I tend to be a little salty and go, well, this is what's happening negatively. And I caught myself yesterday going, well, Jillian doesn't want to know about that, Tracy. She wants to know about the revitalization. And there's so many good examples of that. So one example I wanted to talk about is at UVic, we see that the province of BC has put about $13 million in a $27 million project that's supposed to start in 2023, I think. And it's a National Center of Indigenous Laws, which is amazing. So not only will people at UVic be able to learn about, you know, Canada's laws and things, but they'll also be able to integrate an understanding of that, bringing that bottom layer, as you put it, down up to the forefront and going, okay, how are these things mixing together? And so I think that's a wonderful resurgence and revitalization of that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight, we had Dr. Shailene Jobin on here a week ago or a few weeks ago, and her along with a few others, including Hadley Friedland and a bunch of other folks, heading up the Wokotowin Lodge at the University of Alberta. It's between law and Native studies, and it's basically a place that Indigenous communities work with the lodge to develop workshops where communities are supported and actually researching and developing their own laws and also implementing them and figuring out like all the ins and outs of that, because it's a major undertaking. And so that's happening at the University of Alberta. I think there's also connections to UVic as well, that law center.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's also at the U of A, the Indigenous Science and Technology, which Dr. Kim Tallbear can speak more on when she comes in as a guest.
Next week.
Lots of places where Indigenous scholars and community activists and workers are working, and they really need the support, right? Because some settlers try to like be helpful and try to be included. And so it's really, really important that scholarships and funding are given to like these spaces so that Indigenous people are doing this. Because it's not just scholarship, it's a resurgence of a people and peoples like Jillian was mentioning. So I just wanted to highlight the Bokoto Lodge because I think that's such a beautiful example of this kind of resurgence and revitalization. And law is so central, as we know from the MOOC. I mean, the law creates the space, right? And social relationships and guides it. And to what extent you follow your own laws shows your own integrity. And so I really love the project that Dr. Jobin and others are heading up.
And if you want to make a connection, which is really cool, Dr. Val Napoleon, who is at UVic and probably one of the ones that made the big push for this, she is a mentor for not only myself, but Shailene Jobin and Hadley Friedland. And so she always took care to make those relationships with us and uplift us and mentor us, and so you see, these amazing scholars, not only just thinking about their own shining bright star, but bringing up these young Indigenous scholars and uplifting and mentoring them as well. And that's that part of that accountability and responsibility that we have.
Amen. I love that. Absolutely.
No,
because it's about women. Like, this is what governance is about like women helping women to help the community, to help lift up everyone, right? So there's like the what is it, the motto for University of Alberta is like uplifting the whole people, which is really beautiful. But then you think, what was he talking about back in 1900 whatever? And you're like, was he talking about Val Napoleon and like Tracy Bear and like Aileen Jobin? I don't think so.
I know,
but now we are.
It's and again, I think that kind of concept of community and helping people and making sure that your success is shared with other people is really kind of fundamental to what we're learning too. I mean, there is a vast discrepancy between the philosophies that we're learning versus what we're kind of exposed to like when we leave the house. You know what I'm saying? It's a very different world out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I, when Jillian first asked this question, it's so great to have the pre-show because then I get all my saltiness out and I'm like, rah. But one of the things after I started thinking about, well, what are the good things about it? Your question, Jillian, really reminded me of the Gerald Stanley case and Colton Boushey and how, our current justice systems are flawed. This is what I went to when I'm like, well, what is this revitalization? Seeing these types of things pop up constantly is jarring. So not only are we working on the front lines of creating these, spaces for Indigenous law to flourish and Indigenous worldviews and including, the rest of Canadian society, but we're also seeing these horrible things happen, and we're fighting that on that front as well, right? And so with the amount of people, Indigenous people, that we're only 1% of the population, it's amazing to have settler scholars and allies with us, like Sara, like Dan, like other people who work with us to help us fight all these forest fires that are coming up everywhere. Sara said a fancy word the other day and we were like, she said that there's this word, and I really want to explore it, solipsism. And it's a view or theory that the self is that all that can be known to exist. And Dan, you kind of talked about that, you know, with ignorance is bliss, and with like, we just want to see what we need to see for our own views. Like, I just need to think about my needs and things like that. So
Yeah,
I
it
want to
seems
talk a little bit about that.
It seems to be just such a corrosive, you know, again, we are living in a like deeply capitalist society right now. And I think, you know, there's a thread between solipsism and capitalism and law, even settler law. Because even again, we're talking about the fact that you would turn to institutions to facilitate certain action. Why do you think people are turning to institutions? Because the concept of actually personalizing an experience would be too hard for someone. It's a lot easier to put the responsibility on an organization or an institution to do something bad than to do it yourself. And again, I think that goes along this sort of philosophy that I think we all at times catch ourselves in, you know, because it's all around us, is this idea of what is success. We talk about it a lot, the concept that, you know, money and fame and power and things are seemingly through culture, through pop culture, have come to define success. And the only way that you can kind of do that in a lot of cases is to just get out of my way. I'm going to get what I need to get. And yet when you get to the top, I just keep thinking this of, you know, there's so many billionaires now that have made so much money, and you're thinking, what?
Yeah.
What is your spirit like? You know what I'm saying? You have so much money. Would you spend it if you wanted? What are you doing when you go home at night and you put your head on your pillow? How are you servicing yourself in a way that feels generous to others? And a lot of the time the answer is they're either not thinking of it or they've chosen not to think of it. Because when you personalize an experience and you provide, you know, and you allow yourself empathy to think about other people in need, it kind of unlocks guilt, which a lot of people don't want to access.
Yeah.
And
so, like white fragility, right? So that's what white fragility is based on.
Of solipsism really comes in with the acquittal of Gerald Stanley's, and you know, the prosecution. Everyone was saying that, like, this is not about race. This is not about race. But if you know this story, there is no way that you can make that argument anymore. And so, Dan, like, you're right. I mean, these are tools that give you like another way of looking, and it takes away that veil. It takes away that solipsism and be like, I don't experience racism. This can't be about race. Like, I don't, you know what I mean? So I think it's a crucial piece, because we see it all over the place, right? My experience is the pattern. And so as a result, structural racism can't exist when you have that roadblock in your thinking.
Yeah. So this example of the Stanley trials is super central to this module and to the work we're doing, because this is back to what Tracy was saying, is that like we can get very bogged down by the weight of structural oppression in Canada. We'll talk about Canada and the US as well, but when Tracy was talking, I was just reminded that the family, so the Bushi family, with one of them who's our friend and colleague, Jade, we just love her, and like they fought the whole time. They put, like, you see the film, and with Tasha Hubbard's film and Jade's film, it's like they put their trust in the system, and then the system betrayed them, because that's how the system works. And the system works like that all the time. It is never a broken system. It's a system that works that way. So, so it's like, man, that sucks, you know, like, without swearing. So, but they fought all the way, and they went to the Supreme Court just lately and won, where they won their case. I don't know how it works really, around preemptory challenges, which was used to undermine the jury, an objective jury, for Stanley, where they were seeing every Indigenous person who was visibly coded Indigenous, coded brown, as being preemptive challenge to that guy. you know, or girl, woman, and that is systemic racism. That's how it works, right?
Yeah.
So it reminded me that Indigenous people constantly fight. They're always fighting and struggling. And there's this great book by the Gabriel Dumont Institute called "The Stories of the Road Allowance," and in it is this fantastic story that reminds me. It's called Joseph's Justice. Beautiful art by Sherry Farrell Rosette, and I love this story because it reminds me of this guy, Joseph. You know, this old timer, this old hunter and trapper. He's got a beautiful gun thing and a beautiful beating, right? His wife made beautiful stuff. And he got arrested for nothing. He wasn't part of the resistance in Batoche. He was just walking back with his beaver pelts and his gun. And they were like, hey, you get in the truck, get in the back, you're arrested. And he's like, what for? It's like, well, you're just arrested because you're half-breed. And they're like, that's some bullshit right there, right? Essentially. So he goes all the way to Regina, gets put in prison for a long time, gets out because the judge is like, no, you didn't do anything wrong. And then he's like, well, give me back my gun. And he's like, oh no, well, the general that arrested you took all your stuff. And he's like, that's wrong. Give it back to me. He's like, no, you can't have it. So he goes to the next level and then wins that court battle, right? And then they still said, no, that general, he moved back to England with the Anglais, you know? And he was like, screw this is injustice. So he goes all the way to England to get back his gun and his pelts because they stole it from him, right? So that's what Indigenous people do. Métis, First Nations, Inuit, they're constantly fighting a system that constantly steals from us, you know, and never gives it back for no reason, you know? And that's the thing. That's what Indigenous self-determination is all about. And I love it when it just pops out in a really wonderful children's book.
Yeah, that's an amazing example, Paul. Absolutely. Yeah. And it may seem really small, and you know, maybe there's some listeners and we're like, hey man, can't your wife make you another beaded gun case? Can't you, you know, just get another gun? But that wasn't the point. That's never the issue. The issue is asserting your self-determination, asserting your sovereignty over your things, and having agency, and just always that resistance, right? Yeah.
You bet.
Great example of that.
And he's poor. This is the thing with Indigenous people. We're poor. We're not part of, like, poor in terms of like engaging with systems of privilege, right? Like that's what marginalization is about. We can't always go to Supreme Court, but we do. We can't always travel. Poor Joseph, man, he can't always go to England, but he did, you know, because he's like determined to get his justice, and he did on his terms as a Métis half-breed, right? And it's such a good story. So, and I think there's like a million of those stories out there, and Jade's stories that too. It's just like go and fight, but also relate through your relations and engaging. It's really beautiful. And in all of the darkness, it's amazing, you know? So.
Well, and so many settlers are very quick to say like, wow, these strong people, it's so amazing. But I think we also have to remember that we're making them fight constantly. And cool. You know, like it's not cool to like, oh, you know, put people in positions where they have to be strong and then praise them for being so strong. Like it's
like the ultimate gaslight. It's like setting up a situation where someone has to fight against you and then saying, wasn't that fight great for you?
What a great opportunity for you to be brave.
Just the worst boyfriend ever, you know? God, Canada.
Really, it's a toxic. Someone would call that a toxic relationship.
Yes.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
So I think throughout this entire lesson, we have seen, you know, in all the examples, the sort of legal examples that were used, it's like it took 2 to 3 court cases where people were saying, yes, you're entitled to this. Then it had to go to another court case where it's like, yes, you're entitled. I mean, for me, it's like, I mean, obviously it's just, as a settler, you're incredibly embarrassed and disturbed by the fact that this has to be such a process when, you know, on paper, it's a no-brainer. Someone says you're entitled to it. You're entitled to it. Move on. Everybody who's upset, just deal with it and move on. You know what I'm saying? But it's this settler entitlement that is just relentless in its pursuit to just be right all the time. And even in the face of like legal fact. So Anyway, I mean,
Sure, Dan. I mean, I don't think I see Canadian collectivity quite like when either the Canadian hockey team is playing or, you know, settlers are trying to stop fishermen, or they're trying to stop, you know, Métis hunters, or like those are two of the biggest shows of collectivity that I see, is hockey and racism.
And that is so indicative of something.
Wow.
It's like, what are you fighting for? You're fighting for the state. You're fighting for Canada in that sense of, but why you have to murder people? Like those two Métis hunters, like, and those like, you know, in Mi'kmaq, like being run over by your boat for what? It's that fear of indigenous rights, you know, like their indigenous titles so powerful to the Canadian state. Like it fragments things. It's so weird.
We signed the bloody things. Like,
yeah, exactly.
What? You know?
Yeah. And forget about it. We signed it. Forget about it.
Yeah.
Forget about it.
Go to court to like prove to me that I said that's written down there.
And yet, I mean, you know, what is so admirable, I think, about Canadians is that they are so patriotic, and they are so proud of where they came from. And we were talking about this yesterday. I mean, the concept of like the parades and the shows of excitement over like a hockey. You know, imagine if this country was properly educated on its history from an Indigenous perspective. Imagine how much of a sense of community we could all feel if we rallied together to actually make good on some of the darker chapters of our history. Like that to me is patriotism. That to me is you will get the same kind of national pride that you will get from a hockey game, but in a way more profound and meaningful and constructive and powerful way. Yeah. It's just, you think about these kind of ideal scenarios, and I just keep thinking, it's like, for a country that is so patriotic, wouldn't it be incredible if we were able to come together over this shared understanding that we have work to do in terms of repairing relations?
That's beautiful. And you know, when we brought up hockey, I was saying, you know, there's times in my life as an Indigenous woman that 98% of the time I'm like, oh man, Canada, come on. You know, it's like that black sheep of the family. You can do better. I know you can do it. But I feel that with Canadian women's Olympic team hockey. I don't know what it is. When I see them play and I see them win, I will put a, you know, maple leaf on me. Like, it's just like, there's so much pride. But wow, what a utopia for me anyway, as an Indigenous person, to have Canada celebrate Indigenous people, and not in the way that you see it at the Olympics where they parade people out.
God, yeah.
But a real celebration, and that honoring and pride, and feeling that deep sense of belonging. And like, doesn't everyone want to belong? It's not that Indigenous people don't want to belong to Canada. Absolutely not. That's not even what the treaties were about. We wanted to share this land. And so let's share it. We want to have that sense of belonging, and to have that deep sense of pride, Dan, that you're talking about, knowing all the facts, knowing it all the dirty secrets and all the laundry out, and still working through that. What an amazing country this could be.
I mean, think about fundamentally, like, how lucky are we to live on such sacred ground?
Holy, good time. Oh, Jesus. Absolutely. Because sacred ground means where there's sacred ground are storied places. That's what's really important. And what we are doing with this MOOC, and every time we engage in these different stories that we hear, that's where we start to see the sacredness of relations on the ground, you know? So it's very political, and it's very like engaging that way. So
absolutely, really cool. And sport is an interesting place, like, of intersections of people and cultures. I mean, there's a lot of Indigenous hockey teams in Alberta and across who are like making a lot of struggle, but they also are making a lot of like interesting relationships with people. And And I think, and even a lot of, we see in sports, like with NHL and especially the NBA and WNBA, of people taking the knee and, standing up and like saying like, we have some privilege here, or like we're part of this larger society. How are we going to respond to these things? And it's really important that we see these like seemingly, kind of innocuous spaces of leisure as actually political spaces. I mean, Don Cherry is finally gone, but I mean, he does represent a lot of how people feel. He supports Canadian imperialism abroad and kind of these old stock Canadian values. And so I think, hockey, just like other places, is a site where resistance can be had. And we can actually feel the collectivity that is, based on good ethics. And I mean, I'm not even a nationalist. And when I sometimes watch like Canada's hockey team and I feel like all anxious and I'm like, because like the bull is so strong and I can't.
She gets in a fight stance.
I mean, there is such a joy in getting in a sense of community, cheering for something that means something for a group of people. Like, it is just inherent. I think it's a human thing. It's like, if we can all get together and cheer for something, it's emotional. It's a profound human experience. I just wish that we could, channel that sense of excitement and community into things that will ultimately help the country, and the foundation it was built on.
Yeah, so if Canadian identity could center Indigenous sovereignty, that'd be the bomb, so, right?
Yeah, it's like Canadian, as like a essential piece of Canadianism could be like a new one, could be fighting like anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism and supporting Indigenous sovereignty instead of thinking, how can we help Indigenous people? Like, no, you have to center Indigenous sovereignty and get away from that. Like,
well, imagine if that was what people were rooting for. Imagine the power.
Yeah, like there's the Haudenosaunee lacrosse team. Remember we were talking about this yesterday? How they weren't allowed to go to represent themselves as a nation, and then Ireland said, "We will give you our place to recognize your political sovereignty." That's good allyship, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, so it's super good.
Good job, Ireland. I bet they signed UNDRIP. Just kidding. I know they got their own issues.
They got their own shit.
Got their own stuff, but that's one for the team for sure. So that was question 1. I hope we answered what you meant, Julian. Ended on hockey. I love how our conversations go. So I want to say, does anyone do we want to add any more to that, or you guys want to move?
What was the question again?
That was the fullest conversation we've had around a single question to date. So
I think so too. Yeah. This is Kristen Orr, and she's interested. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say last names. Damn. I'm interested in how traditional knowledge is being incorporated into caring for the environment, as in caribou herd management, because there was some of that in the module. What are some more specific examples of TEK being considered or incorporated into environmental decisions? Yeah, I think we'd like to let our guests start.
Thank you. Well, Kristen, I think I would direct you to some of the sources that's listed in the bibliography, because they go into them. But I did want to sort of flip the script a little bit and think about not just that Indigenous knowledges are being incorporated into settler departments and their environmental decisions, but that Indigenous nations are actually like asserting control and saying that they should have their own bodies of administrative control because they have the knowledge to do it, and also that it's their right. So I wanted to just highlight the most recent conflict that the settlers are sort of imposing on the Mi'kmaq fishermen and communities. So you've probably seen it in the news. Settler fishermen have encircled Mi'kmaq fishermen and messed with their traps and intimidation tactics. And this is because in the Atlantic region, for hundreds of years, the Mi'kmaq fishermen and peoples have been trying to get the 1752 treaty recognized. And even if you look it up, you can find all these instances of people like leaders like, you know, Gabriel Sillyboy and Marshall, Donald Marshall and Donald Marshall Jr., constantly working to get this particular treaty recognized. And it still happens because, again, we just had a flare up of racial violence and settler assertions. And so I wanted to bring up what Professor Wildcat said, is that like we have a lot of remembering to do, and like bare minimum, you can even look at what area you live in, what the treaties say, what sort of struggles people are embroiled in, what communities are embroiled in struggle, and learn about them so that we can support them and think about ways that what are they doing with their knowledge, and you know, how can I help and how can I support that? And so I just wanted to bring up this Mi'kmaq fishery piece because I think it's really important, but it's important on multiple levels because the son of Donald Marshall Jr. is actually one of the fishermen who got a ticket recently and was so he's in the news, and his father was actually a man who was also embroiled in the same issue after he was imprisoned for 11 years after being wrongfully convicted of murder. And so it was a complete result of systemic racism in the courts. And so like, it's so important that we're reading these narratives and understanding them because they're going on right now. And I think there's like a new board of fisheries for the Mi'kmaq people. And I know there's a lot of strife and racism coming from white fishermen still. And this is something that, like, as Canadians, as settlers, we really need to deal with ourselves. And like settlers need to get out there and put themselves between those people if they want to be supportive. Because it's always Indigenous people that are facing violence as a result of upholding treaties that we signed with them. And so I just wanted to bring up the Mi'kmaq piece because those fishermen and those communities are fighting for things that they shouldn't have to get not only get their knowledge sort of recognized, but just to practice treaty.
I would be very, very curious to know if any of those people who are opposing even know or have read the treaty.
Yeah, they didn't. They do not. They do not.
I can.
Those. Yeah.
I mean,
they do not. Because it's like, that's the point, right? It's like Indigenous people know their history more than settlers do because of that layer. You don't need to know anything beneath the layer, whereas Indigenous people constantly need to know, and they talk about it, right? We tell the stories of like treaty and why that's important in these nation to nation relations, right? The operative word is treaty with others, right? Like, I think that's super important. That's why the Mi'kmaq, they're not just engaging in capitalism, which is why the multi-billion-dollar fishing industry out there is super mad or whatever to these 10 fishermen or fisher women and men. It's that the Mi'kmaq have a relation with the lobster, and they have a relation with those people and those more than human people, the land. If you don't do that, chaos ensues, right? Like, so, you know, Tracy?
And how do you explain that nation to nation? We've talked about nation to nation with treaty building, and you know, long before, you know, any settler explorer stepped on Turtle Island or North America, we had treaties with each other constantly. But a lot of people just think it's like between humans, and it hasn't been. There are nation to nations in which I can speak as my teachings as a Cree person. You know, we have treaties and nation to nation agreements with the buffalo. We treat them in a certain way. We have certain ways in which we hunt, in which we, you know, butcher, in which we respect calves, mothers, you know, all sorts of things. There's all these laws that we adhere to. And so when those laws are broken nation to nation, And we have, the Fish Nation, we have the Elk Nation, the Caribou Nation, all across Canada. You can see Indigenous people referring to every other living thing as a nation. And so how do you get that kind of worldview across to other people in respecting the types of things, the land, and respecting the caribou, the calving grounds? And so when you think about Indigenous people, like, why are you protesting? Why are you blocking these? We're protecting. We are trying to uphold those nation to nation treaties that we not just have with the Crown, but that we have with the buffalo, that we have with the caribou, that we have with other nations. And so, with the TEK, it's great traditional ecological knowledge. And it's a fancy thing. And just like solipsism, I love that word too. It's a great word and it's a great thought, but there's deeper Indigenous knowledges that actually have this worldview, and that's where it comes from. It's not just a fancy new term for us. It's something that we're actually accountable and responsible to.
Yeah. What's that word there? It's like where you are in charge of things, like that's sort of like that sort of Judeo-Christian worldview of like, I am Adam and I'm going to name all these animals and they will be my possessions, right? What do you call that? Can't think of the word.
More vocabulary than I do.
Yeah. So it's because that's essentially what it is. It's like we always have this possessive attitude over all of these things. We objectify everything, and we never ever center like consent. We never center agency, self-determination. Like in our relationships, we own each other. We own this land. We own that animal. We could skin it and could profit from it. But all of that is not what Indigenous nations do, because that is horrifying, really. It creates so much chaos. And then when we think about like Lutzoke and like we think about conservation, actually, that's what I was thinking about too, is that conservation for settler Canadians, for white people, is about, okay, we have to manage these animals and not hunt them and stuff like that. Whereas there's communities in the north who are like, if we don't hunt them, they think we don't care about them anymore. And that violates these treaty agreements that we continuously operationalize, continuously do over and over again. And it's that sort of like that lack of understanding self-determination and agency of different humans and more than humans, as well as that relegation of agency. That is really a big problem in our Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations today, And I'll think of the word and then I'll blurt it out.
All right.
You guys will be like,
well, Paul, what you're saying reminds me of what we were talking about the other day, of settler projection and the fear of like, well, if Indigenous people are allowed to hunt or fish all year long, and what if they overfish, and what if they there's like stocks are low? It's like
you do that.
Yeah, that's you.
Excuse me.
So illuminating. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's when you lay it out like that, it is just so illuminating. This concept of, well, wait a minute, what if they're doing what we're doing? What if they
screwed
exploit the world like we're doing?
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that. And again, I think another key kind of message to be taken out of this, which is not a new message, but still one that's important to constantly be reminded of, is just, if you have personal relations with things, it makes it harder to destroy them.
That's right. That elder said, you will not care for, you do not care for that you don't love. You won't care for it. And our disconnection to all of these things. And it's easy to disconnect. And we talked about that right in the beginning, Dan. We've got these distractions and, it's easy just to focus on yourself and just your immediate family, but there's a larger issues at stake here. And there's, our planet is at stake.
And you have to let it go free, right? If you love something, you have to give it its self-determination, right? It's like you have to let it go, because then you're owning something, And that's a lot of BS, man. You know, like how can you love something back if they're owning you and all over your stuff, you know? So yeah.
Well, and you know, Indigenous nations have been in relation and caretaking the land for millennia, and now, you know, we're suffering global warming. Like there's mass environmental crises all over the place, right? Like, so it's really important, not just for like good politics, but actual for like reasons of environmental care that. I know Paul, you weren't liking the word stewardship, but that's stewardship like, to the people that know this land and know how to be in relation with it, that is sustainable and like, that values non-human beings as well, because that's what's not happening. You know, even though there's some change, of course, and there's some like good things happening, obviously, but overall, you know, we're in a crisis.
Yeah, the word I was looking for was stewardship. I kept thinking animal husbandry. Thanks, Sarah. I knew it'd come to me. So what does stewardship mean to a settler colonial perspective? It's about being able to manage everyone, right? Manage everyone. That does not work.
Oh man, we have a really great question here that I'd really like to get to before we get to the Thanksgiving thing. Do you think we have time, Dan?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. This is from Kat, and she's watching a news conference in Quebec where they appointed a new Minister of Indigenous Affairs. Used to be called Indian Affairs. That if I go back to Indian Affairs, I'm sorry, it's just always been Indian Affairs. It's just changed. In response to Joyce Etchicon's treatment in the hospital. This person's non-Indigenous, Caucasian, and a former police inspector. Both facts are problematic to me. Can any effective measures be implemented without Indigenous people as a decision maker? I think if we polled everybody who's listening, they'd be like, no. So, but why? Why is this problematic? Sarah?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Kat. So I'd like to, again, kind of like flip the question and think about like who or what might benefit from this appointment. And what might this do to sort of continue a narrative, right? We have to remember that and I also say the Department of Indian Affairs began as a diplomatic space to work with Indigenous allies. But then it turned into administrative body of to sort of administrate genocide through enfranchisement and famine and all the, you know, we've touched on them earlier in the course. So this department is not for Indigenous people, I'd argue, right? This is the department is there to facilitate
and manage.
Historically to facilitate the dispossession of Indigenous people, the dispossession of Indigenous women's leadership through specifically gender discrimination in the Indian Act, but across the board as well, including like, you know, traditional governments. And now we've got hereditary and band council, dispossession of land, women's leadership, kind of an array of things. And so I'd argue that it makes a lot of sense that a white person is at the helm because there's a very specific project here. And of course, there's a lot of change that's happened throughout the years, but this department was never made to last, because if you read the archival documents from this department, you read that the plan was to enfranchise all Indigenous people, absorb them into the body politic, and then the department would be dissolved. There would be no need for it. Yeah. So it's through Indigenous resistance that this thing even still exists, because Indigenous people did not go quietly into the night, right? They resisted constantly, and they still are. And so that's why, because it's not something where you can be like, okay, well, let's do this in an anti-racist way. It's like, this is a racist colonial.
See, that's it. And in our little pre-discussion yesterday, that was the huge sort of takeaway for me, because I just, naively asked the question. I'm thinking, okay, it's the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, and the person overseeing this ministry is not an Indigenous person.
Yeah.
If you were to swap out any other group, you know, it's like the Ministry of Gay Affairs, and they're putting a straight police officer in charge of the Ministry of Gay Affairs. I mean, there would be a revolt. It would be, I mean, it's just so but upon, you know, understanding, of course it makes sense that there is a settler person in charge of this, because the actual ministry itself, despite its title, and again, knowledge is power, and now that people have this understanding, now that everyone who's watching right now actually can go home right now, you know, and learn about the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs and what it was rooted in, the fact that it still exists seems horrifying. And the fact that it hasn't been dismantled and rebuilt to reflect its title in a way, in a constructive way, is really eye-opening in terms of being able to see in a very clear way how tied to the past areas of the Canadian government still are, in a very unabashed way. That is really, like, think about it. Anyone out there who's, like, you know, part of a group, imagine swapping your name into that ministry and then looking and seeing someone who is completely opposite to your community representing that ministry. Like, that is really, really wild.
It really is. And, you know, I loved your example about the Ministry of Gay Affairs because I just think, you know, the Indian Act, and, you know, the Ministry of Indian Affairs defines who an Indian is. And so the Ministry of Gay Affairs would actually have that definition for you, and who would be able to be one in the future, you know. And it was such an amazing sort of analogy or metaphor to think about that swap and the ridiculousness of it, you know. It was a hilarious conversation.
And it shows it. It's funny because, like, the more that the government changes, the more it stays the same. Because, like, the liberals who are totally woke and young and, like, you know, half women, half men kind of thing, you know, like, they changed. They took RCAP's, the one RCAP suggestion that they took was to separate the INAC into two. So Indigenous Services and then Nation to Nation. So, like, a department of Nation to Nation. So 2 more bureaucrats who are paid that, whatever. But it's funny how you think that this is, okay, RCAP was about, you know, what can this Royal Commission do to make better relations between Canada? But really what they are doing a lot of is downloading, like, their own responsibility, the fiduciary duties, onto different nations. So it's, again, Canada's misrecognition of nationhood. And that's a constant problem, because it's like the reason why there is a department is because Indigenous people are strong. You know, it's that Indigenous title is really, really strong and scary to that institutional settler mentality.
Exactly. You need this giant overblown ministry in order to be the stewardship, right?
That's
and
right.
I know you hate that word. They're stewards of Indigenous people to control, to manage. Absolutely. And
like Adam's naming them.
Yeah.
And there was an attempt to dissolve it, of course, in the 60s, and it culminated, Dr. Jobin talked about it, the white paper and then the red paper. But the government, and it was Pierre Trudeau at the time, and the Minister of Indian Affairs was Jean Chrétien. And the idea was that, you know, in order to right the wrongs of the past with settler Indigenous relations, we'll dissolve this department and dissolve all difference in rights so that we all experience equality under the law. So that includes any treaty rights, any sacred rights that Indigenous people have, because equality under the law is better than adhering to treaty and respecting that nation-to-nation relationship. So, and that speaks to the sort of logics that the Canadian government still has, is just this idea of liberal democracy and equality as the way forward, as opposed to recognizing Indigenous sovereignty.
Because it sounds so good on the outside. Yeah, of course, the average Canadian would say, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't everyone want to be equal? You know, didn't Dr. Bear talk about like the hockey and being proud? And, you know, does she want that? But, you know, if you were to dissolve that, as Harold Cardinal wrote in the Red Paper, if you were to dissolve the Indian without anything in return, then that is taking away all those treaties and nation to nation, you know, agreements that we had. And it's so sneaky.
That was the original intent.
Yeah.
Repackaged.
Yeah. I originally, when I think about the Ministry of Indian Affairs, I always think of George Orwell's 1984. And man, people need to read that because there's so much connection in what we're seeing today. And in 1984, in the book 1984, they had the Ministry of Love, which was not the Ministry of Love at all, right? It was the Ministry of War and Hate, and it had all of these things. And I constantly think about the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs being really the Ministry of settler colonialism. It's nothing about Indigenous people at all. It's just that control and management, right? Wah, wah. Oh, we have. What did you want to say?
Holy man, jeez, It's like that's the system that we're constantly having to navigate, and I think I go back to Adam Godry, who the hot and sexy, and sorry, this is an inside joke. That like he talks about like in nation to nation. Let's go back to those relations again and focus on that. Stop centering whiteness all the time, right?
Yeah.
So, but we're so relational that we get embroiled in these one-sided relationships. And now, so how do you break up with your bad boyfriend, right? Kick him out? It's like that kind of like, what do you do with this system? What do you do with this thing? So,
well, I like what Dan said. Like, if you do have ideas about like just get rid of the Ministry of Indian Affairs, but dismantle it and rebuild, and that rebuilding would absolutely need to include Indigenous people. Like, what would this type of ministry be for? And I believe it might not ever happen in my lifetime. It would be about sovereignty. It would be about self-determination, and it would be a process of giving land back. So we'll see if that ministry.
In the 60s, the government did a fact-finding mission to see how the ministry could be dissolved, and all of the information that they gathered was swiftly thrown out the window, and then the white paper was introduced. So it's not like they didn't even have the ideas. So yeah, let's hope. But again, we can all be a part of that as well, right? In our own ways, and sort of wielding our privilege and engaging with our, like, creating ethical principles of governance, and then seeing how we can see those enforced.
Yeah.
And also just, I think from a settler perspective, being more active than I think people have been used to, or have been conditioned to be, to understand what equality means.
Yeah.
And I think that's why the concept of police has been in the headlines so often, and so sort of crucial and central to a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement that's happening here and across the world, but particularly in the United States, because the concept of white people saying, well, we are equal, everyone's able to walk around, and yet you are dealing with a subsection of the law that is rooted in racism. So for white people who are not getting murdered senselessly, and who are being let off the hook, and who are being sort of absolved of any kind of guilt or responsibility regardless, they're not even categorically described. The vernacular used, even in the media, describe white people who have done wrong versus people of color, is one is vilified, one is not. And so as white people, as settler people, you have been conditioned, I speak for myself, to be in a different place of understanding what equality is, because your day-to-day is completely safe. Your children are safe. Your family is safe. You don't have to worry about your family members going to the store or going on a jog. So it's this awareness, this active awareness of what equality means to everybody in order to be able to even begin to form an opinion on what equality means to you.
Yeah.
That's you're so eloquent, Dan. And you're so much more than the average student, as the as the New York Times said about you.
Totally. I agree.
That they said I said about you.
Trust me.
Freaking Tracy.
Teachers would describe me as an average student.
And so on that note, I love this last question, and we can't take all the beautiful questions. We can't answer them all. As you can see, it took 45 minutes for the first one. But lastly, is there anything you want all of us to think about this weekend and this Thanksgiving Monday? I've been taking some time to do a bit of self-education during the holiday the past couple of years, and it's been eye-opening. So last words on what we want maybe people to think about as they're gathering around their family table and eating tofu turkey or trout in our case, or whatever.
I think prefacing this by saying, like, collectively, you know, there are a lot of Canadians out there who are going to be saying, you know, Canadian Thanksgiving is rooted in a different kind of history than American Thanksgiving. So I think just to preface this whole conversation saying we are aware that it is a slightly different experience, but I do think that one concept of Thanksgiving has prevailed regardless. So I think just to preface this by saying, generally speaking, you know, what are the thoughts? Just to cover the bases from all the, you know, the Canadians that'll be writing in saying, well,
thanks, Dan.
Thanksgiving is this is not the same thing. So
is that your Canadian voice?
That's his Canadian Twitter voice. That's his Twitter voice.
That you've never seen me angry. That's the only voice I make when I'm upset.
Love it.
Oh my God.
So, what do we think?
I really liked Tracy's answer, but do you want me to go first, Tracy?
Yeah, we'll do Tracy's answer last.
So you know, Thanksgiving is often a time where people are gathering, though hopefully they're bubbling properly. So if you're going to be around your family, you know, sometimes there's, you know, things can be fraught. Maybe, you know, maybe you're LGBT and you've got a really homophobic uncle, or maybe like, you know, you're a partner going into a family, like, you know, there's lots of stuff that is fraught with family gatherings. But, you know, as a settler, I would encourage fellow settlers to engage family, engage people that listen to your voice, and talk to them about some of these things, and try to pick apart their whiteness in ways that, you know, might click, right? Like put your teacher hat on, and try to talk and make a connection. And I know that can be really uncomfortable. I've been there for sure, but just remember that discomfort is fine. You know, if you're safe, like, remember, like, ask yourself, like, am I safe? And if the answer is yes, then discomfort is something that you can sort of work through. And remember that BIPOC, so Black and Indigenous people of color, are often left to do this work. They're often asked by white people to explain racism and settler colonialism, which again, sort of in this whole conversation is kind of sadistic and like sick. So let's not do that, because it's everyone's responsibility, every settler's responsibility to address white supremacy and use all the spaces that you can, including your family, because it starts with relations. You know, as Paul and Tracy have been saying throughout the weeks, like, think about the relations that you have and think about ways that you can, you know, incorporate some of these principles and concepts that you've learned from the course. And sometimes just talking about the course can be really helpful, and like kind of a nice talk about, you know, Dan Levy in this course. And it's been really how it's been for you as like maybe a way to ease in.
Excellent.
I think that's so awesome. I think like I'm pointing to you. I think this has been a really good experience to ease people into the conversation to push back against white supremacy. Like even that concept is though so normative. It's really challenging, and this is where fragility comes in. So like I see my family members really changing because of the weekend at Dan Levy's, like weekend at Levy's, which is a dumb name. I admit. So like this is because we made this circle together, and it just happened, right? And I think like these are the opportunities that we can then sort of bridge the cat connections and make good relations, right? So it's really cute cat to be there. I must say, like our family, okay, Métis French Canadians, we never really celebrated Thanksgiving in the same way. So we do a paella every we make paella every time because my sister-in-law, who's been in our family for a million years, is from Spain. She's from Alicante, and we just make paella at Christmas time, at Thanksgiving, at Easter, like all of these family events. We come together, we make this paella, and it always reminds me that like we can change. Firstly, because like growing up in rural Saskatchewan, I had no idea what a paella was, like, and that it's situated in our families, like that these small things make bigger changes, hopefully. So systems start with you, I guess, right? And your relations.
Well, I don't really want to end with me. I want to end with Dan. So I'll say my piece before Dan. Ha ha ha.
Very sorry.
I got it. Okay.
Click. So I think, remind me if I go off track, but what I said yesterday with this idea of gratitude. And I read a saying that is attributed to Poundmaker, who was a Cree chief that signed Treaty 6. He said, when you wake up in the morning, you have to give thanks and gratitude. And if you have nothing to say, no thanks to give, then the fault lies within yourself. And so when I wake up in the morning, I do that. I think about all the things that I'm so grateful for. And it could be just, breathing, being able to breathe, especially, when so many people are suffering from COVID and have issues with their lungs, like taking that deep breath, your lungs are working fine, your little alveoli are working fine. And so, when you're gathered around with your family and friends, and doesn't necessarily mean blood family, it could be that kin that you make, you're gathered around with that, really think about the blessings that you have and the gratitude that you have. So many people are, because of our society, and Dan, you talk about the capitalism and the materialism and that kind of wealth that we think will provide us happiness, but really the wealth that you have is within that kinship and within those relations that you make. That is your true wealth. When you're on your deathbed, do you want your jet ski and your, all your furs and your Gucci bags surrounding you? Or would you want your children and your family beside you? Think about that. And so before you eat, it's not a religious thing, and it doesn't even need to be a spiritual thing. Like give that thanks and gratitude for what you have, and stop considering what you don't have in that way.
Hi. Hi.
I mean, you've set me up for failure.
Thanks, Dan.
Possibly say that was more meaningful than that. Well, I mean, I think there are so many of us who are watching this that are going to be giving thanks for this discussion that we have every week. And I think, again, like for me, you're sitting down to a table, you're going to be cooking food. There's so much that that I particularly, I'm not going to speak for other people, but I will say that I've taken from this. And I think even on the smallest surface of things, I think communication is key. If we've learned anything from these discussions, it's that if you create a safe space for people to be informed and to make self-improvement feel exciting and not like an attack, for me, I understand that I have so much more to learn and I have so much more to do. And I have, you know, that this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of my learning and my improvement and the reparations that I need to make with, you know, being a settler and the history that my people have sort of been involved with, even in a kind of orbital way. You know, it's knowledge is power. And the fact that I have been able to have these discussions and feel safe enough to ask certain questions, I think is a really powerful way of sharing information. And I think when you sit down with families or with friends, you know, for a big feast, whether you're celebrating, you know, the concept of Thanksgiving or whether you're just having a community-based experience at a socially distanced situation, you know,
Bubbles.
It's about sharing these stories. It's about telling people what you're learning in a way that is exciting. It doesn't have to be you're not doing something by, you know, by not understanding this or by not having this information. It should feel, again, going back to that sense of national pride, it really feels like we should be coming together with a sense of pride about the fact that we have a lot to learn and a lot to do. And yes, that is, you know, hard for people to understand, and it creates a sense of embarrassment, and it's an awkwardness, and it's a, you know, there's a sadness in a lot of people in terms of coming to that kind of place of understanding. It should be, yes, that is all, process that, but also there's an enthusiasm that should be met with the prospect of doing better and doing good. And that can be large scale and it can be small scale. And in terms of relations today and the conversations that we've had, even sitting down and saying, where did my food come from?
Yes.
Is the food that I'm eating going to be contributing to some of the lessons that I'm learning about the overtaking of the land, the exploitation of the land? What am I doing even in the choice of having Thanksgiving? What can I do to actively implement some of the things that I have learned over these 8 weeks? And I think, you know, even by shopping more, you know, thoughtfully when it comes to preparing your meal, you are honoring these discussions. I know that I certainly will. I'm not going to be having Thanksgiving, but it is certainly something that I've adapted into the day-to-day, because it is a very simple way of acknowledging and actively showing that I am learning and trying.
I am so grateful that for these conversations, Dan. Thank you so much. Wow. And Sara, finally people get to meet you, because we've been quoting you for a long time and know that she's always in the background with us working on stuff. And Paul, as usual, your laugh and your friendliness. I mean, he's really, everyone might think that he looks good to hug. He really is. And you know,
Don't do it on the street though. If you
don't hug Paul on the street.
Zoom hugs only.
Not do that yet.
So I'm grateful for you guys. I'm grateful for everyone who writes in and brings their questions, and so thoughtful, and all you learners out there that are taking time to do this MOOC and to come in with these discussions. So, you know, my heart is full today.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy, too, eh? What's next week?
Oh, next week. Yes, next week we have Kim Tallbear, and we're doing Module 9 with Indigenous women. And I don't know if you or I'll get much to speak, Paul, because she is a powerhouse, and
she's amazing.
Yeah, it'll probably be Dan and her talking most of the time. But she's amazing. So we have another great guest for you. So I'm looking forward to that.
Looking forward to it. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Love you guys.
Take care.
Bye.